Good evening. I'm coming to you Thanksgiving evening, actually. Just got done celebrating with the family and putting the kids down and all of those sorts of fun things. I hope you also got some good time with your family, eating some good food, but also to take a moment and to thank God for the things that you're grateful for and His rich blessings in your life. I know that I'm grateful for every single one of you, and I'm really looking forward to continuing our Pipes and Pints nights this coming Thursday, the 30th. We're going to be talking about Just War Tradition. We'll meet at my house. Again, I'll send out obviously all those details again. Invite anyone that you'd like. Love to have more guys there. So why am I doing a video? So in preparing for this next Pipes and Pints night, what I kind of found as I scoured the internet for the right video or podcast was that there really was not a great introductory video that covered kind of the history a little bit, some of the terms. This is a really complex topic. That was the other thing that I realized, is how little, honestly, I knew about Just War Tradition. And so, I've been learning loads over the last week or two. What I'm going to try and do is just kind of distill down some of the basic foundational stuff that I think is really beneficial for us to have a great conversation this coming Thursday. So I'll try and be really brief with this so that there's not kind of a big commitment. I'll send out lots of other material. Do check those out. I think that would be really lovely for us to all have read up on this, brushed up on this. But without further ado, I'll kind of dive in and try and cover the foundational material. So why study Just War? There's really three things that I've laid out here on this slide, which is many of us, most of us, are part of churches that are within the Catholic Just War tradition. Obviously, using Catholic there in the sense of, sort of everywhere, always. The Roman Catholic Church, significant contributor into the Catholic Just War tradition. However, many traditions pick that up and run with that and carry that tradition forward. And so we're part of these churches that carry this tradition forward, but yet it's rarely discussed. And honestly, because of how complex of a topic it is, I think that it's often not very well understood. I realized how much, again, as I was studying, how much I kind of had misassumed or had misunderstood about how kind of this just war tradition varies from just war theory, which I'll come back to in just a little bit. So we need to talk about this. We need to understand this. Theology is inherently practical. And so we need to be able to do good theology around just war so that we wage war justly, that we use force rightly. Secondarily, this topic has only increased in priority and importance and frequency, right? War has been the case, at least in my life, for the United States, I think my whole life. We've seen conflicts around the globe. We've seen conflicts shift from, uniformed armies fighting to non-combatants and terrorists and lots of different kind of nuances and difficulties, and I don't think any of that's going away anytime soon. And so we need to be preparing as a generation of men, as the next couple generation of men, to respond to where the world will go, and to be able to use just war as God's ordained means to restore order and to preserve justice. Third, there's a chance here for moral injury. So what do I mean by that? Christians who are soldiers or maybe law enforcement officers, which, that's kind of adjacent with the use of force, they might feel like they are part of a necessary evil, or that they have dirty hands, or that some of the things they've done can't be reconciled with their Christian faith. And the reality is that just honestly is not true. If God has ordained governments, which we're going to talk about, we're going to see the biblical basis for in just a second, and He has ordained, and He has set aside, He's consecrated, He's called some men to serve in those positions for the good, then the things that those people are doing to restore order, to preserve justice, it's good. It's actually how they love their neighbor. It's how they love even their enemy. We'll come to that idea again in just a second. And so it's not a necessary evil. We want to maybe nuance this and say, yes, like, war is sad. It is a sad reality of a fallen world. But it's not this sort of necessary evil take or this kind of dirty hands take. It's this last resort that we take to bring and restore justice, but it is ultimately good. And so what we don't want to do is to, in any way, shape, or form, put our fellow Christian brothers in a position where they feel like they've done something wrong or something unchristian or something that God does not want them to be doing. And so we injure them, we injure their soul, and we injure their perceived sense of their moral kind of standing when we err on this. So we talked about governments being ordained by God. This would obviously be our kind of tent pole passage for where that comes from. This is the 13th chapter of St. Paul's epistles to the Romans. It says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer." We see that God has instituted governments, that it is for our good, that he bears the sword, and he carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. We can't shy away from this. Those that would seek to kind of try and build some sort of case around Christian pacifism or as sort of other ideas here, they really do have to deeply contend with this passage. And the historic just war tradition would build on this passage to understand what is the purpose and why do we do these things. We're going to come back to this passage at the very end to kind of connect it to that love piece, love of neighbor, love of enemy. But for now, let's talk just very briefly about kind of the history of the Catholic just war tradition. I'm going to go through this super fast. So St. Augustine wrote a book called City of God while the Visigoths were actually sacking Rome. So answering a lot of questions around exactly what is the Christian participation in sort of temporal kingdoms versus God's heavenly kingdom that reigns here on earth even now. And so he answered some of those questions in there, but it wasn't really in a systematic way. And so it's not really until St. Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologica in the 13th century that we start to see kind of a treatment of a whole system. So if you've heard things like just in bello, just ad bellum, those sorts of things, that's where a lot of that is coming from. So the Reformation obviously contended with a lot of different situations. Luther had to contend with kind of the political realities of what was happening on the continent, kind of as the sad outflow of the Reformation. So whether the princes should put down a peasant revolt, or exactly how should the Christian soldier participate in war, some of those questions, but not, again, in a systematic way. Luther didn't tend to kind of think things through systematically. He was more kind of responding to specific instances. A lot of times, John Calvin, he would be someone who would, his Institutes is a big systematic work. It's like, I don't know, a bajillion volumes, 20 volumes, something like that. And so the Reformed tradition would kind of carry on what John Calvin had done there. John Calvin had pulled very much so from Aquinas and Augustine, earlier contributors in kind of the Catholic tradition. There's just a little bit of nuance because of their Reformed theology within how the Reformed understand the Catholic tradition. Anabaptists, I just want to call them out briefly to say these are individuals that would be outside the Catholic tradition, both in terms of their understanding of just warfare, but also really just kind of many aspects of the faith. Anabaptists literally means rebaptizers. These were individuals who did not believe in the efficacy of the sacrament of holy baptism when it was bestowed upon infants, so they would rebaptize people. They also sought to separate from the state entirely, and so they wouldn't participate in government in any way, shape, or form. The Mennonites, if you've heard of Mennonites, they're kind of descendants of the Anabaptists. And so we would say these are actually individuals that are firmly outside of the Catholic tradition, but they essentially took up a pacifistic stance because of all of their teaching and thinking. From the 16th to the 19th centuries, we see kind of two things. First, we see kind of specific thinkers responding to specific instances. So this picture here is of a Spanish theologian who was responding to questions of exactly how should Spain operate in the New World, both in terms of instilling new order as well as preserving the order once that came under attack. But what we also saw as kind of a secondary trend was this growing shift towards secularism. So the Age of Enlightenment and modernity assaulted, a vast majority of traditions. And so what we saw here is that just war tradition started to turn into just war theory. Okay, and that's a distinction now that I kind of want to make, because just war theory is a political theory used by nation states, secular nation states, to justify their actions on the world stage. which is different than just war tradition, which is the historic Christian position, which is we live out of a virtue and a wisdom that has cultivated deeply in our lives through the means of grace, through the sacraments, through God's work in our lives, that enables us to live out that virtue in the means of just war. Okay, so as this secular shift happened, what also started to happen was Catholic and Protestant mainline traditions really started to kind of abandon just war as a concept. They started to take a pacifistic stance and say that there's no such thing as a just war, which, again, we're going to contend is not true. So Paul Ramsey is an individual who wrote a couple books in the 1960s, kind of assaulting both those within the Christian fold that would see no case for just war, as well as reinvigorating this idea of this just war tradition and bringing these ideas that have been around for 2,000 plus years and carrying them forward. So this is the piece that you might have seen before if you've kind of engaged with this topic, kind of different categories of justice. Jus is just the Latin word for justice. So jus ad bellum is justice to war. So these are the principles that we would evaluate as in the lead up of should we declare war here. This is another big point of distinction between just war theory of the secular side and just war tradition. So just war theory, from a secular standpoint, they're going to look at this like a checklist. Okay, if I can tick these things off the list, then I'm good to go, right? I am allowed to declare war. I've waged a just war. I'm good. Which again, so right, this notion of Christian just war as a virtue that is lived out is something to be practiced. And so really what we would see these things as is the questions and things that we need to evaluate to live out that wisdom and in the world in virtue. It's something that is a discipline that would be practiced and cultivated. And so some of these questions, let's just kind of briefly walk through them. A legitimate authority. So a legitimate authority speaks to those who actually have the authority to declare war in the first place. So for instance, I do not have a legitimate authority to declare war on anyone. I do have a legitimate authority over my own home to defend it, right? And so there's authorities of different, ranks, right? So a governor has a legitimate authority that surpasses mine, but is different than the legitimate authority of the President of the United States or other individuals in the world. And so this legitimate authority piece isn't just necessarily kind of the national interests line that you might hear on kind of the mainstream media. This isn't just, we protect our interests and we're allowed to do whatever we want to protect the United States or to protect Texas. We have a legitimate authority when there's a genocide going on in another country to step in and say, no, this is wrong. This is morally reprehensible, and we actually are justified in stepping in here and putting a stop to this. So, whether this was why we went to war in World War II or not, what we did in World War II by stopping the genocide of both the Jewish people and the Chinese people at the hands of the Germans and the Japanese was good. That was a legitimate use of our moral authority. So next is a just cause. A just cause is, pretty self-explanatory. We can't just go into this for vengeance or for conquest or some other kind of means of evil, right? We have to have a cause that is seeking to restore order, to preserve justice, or to prevent some future harm from being done. So preemptive war actually does fit within the just war tradition. And so our cause must be just. Right intent. This is a little bit different than just cause, but it can sound similar. Right intent needs to speak to what are kind of our motives here, right? Rather than just necessarily the end. So if our motives are things like hatred or destruction, that's not within the category of just war tradition. However, if our motives are to use force to accomplish justice, that is a right intent, okay? And so there's going to be a delineation within the just war tradition between violence and force. Violence is something that we actually sort of prohibit. We don't seek out violence. We do seek to use appropriate force to restore justice, to do justice. Okay, so a likelihood of success is something else also that we need to evaluate. There's two aspects to this. First, is there a likelihood that we can win this war? That's the kind of the obvious piece. That's the pragmatic piece. But then secondarily, can we accomplish the means, that just cause that we just talked about? Can we accomplish that just cause through this war? And what is the likelihood that we will accomplish that? So if it's, restoring the borders of some nation, or if it's putting a stop to some evil, do we think that not only can we defeat the enemy, but can we cause what we need to do in justice through warfare to actually happen? And if that can't happen, then we should, pause and reflect about exactly what are the next actions that we should take. Proportionality of ends. So what this looks like is, exactly what kind of sort of response should we have, and how is it proportionate to the evil or the injustice that has been done or that we're trying to prevent. And so, we cannot surpass the evil that is being done, and that would be a disproportionate response, right? So if there's, let's say, a border dispute, right, and some nation has come in and has taken some portion of land, well, what we can't do is then say that the terms of this warfare is we're going to conquer the other nation. That goes beyond the just cause that we set out, which is to restore the borders that have been infracted in the first place. So last resort. Last resort is, war should be a last resort. Just as simple as that. We should seek diplomatic means, other means, and when those have failed, then we resort to warfare. Warfare is not our first option. It is a sad reality. Again, not a necessary evil, but a sad reality of our fallen world. Jus in bello. So these are the principles for justice within war. So once a war has been declared, and the Christian tradition would really say a just war has been declared. Just war theory would have kind of this notion of you could have an unjust war and people still acting justly within it. I think that's kind of debatable within the Christian tradition how true that actually is. It might be the case that Christians have to say we don't participate in an unjust war, period, full stop. But, we could talk about that. So justice in war, the first piece here is discrimination. So this is pretty obvious. We don't target civilians. We don't target wounded soldiers intentionally. We don't exterminate prisoners, right? We target active threats. This has become obviously very difficult in the way warfare is waged nowadays without, kind of uniformed armies. Aquinas has a helpful metaphor here, which is if a lumberjack was chopping down a tree in a forest that no one ever came through, and it just so happened that someone did, and the tree fell and killed that person. Well, the lumberjack isn't really morally culpable because he had no intention to kill a person. He had no reason to expect that someone might be coming through that area. Whereas if it's a forest that's frequented by a lot of people walking around, and he then irresponsibly chops down that tree and it does fall and kill someone, well, yeah, there's a different level of moral culpability there. And so those are some of the kind of analogies or frameworks that we can use to evaluate how do we live out discrimination in this kind of more difficult context in which we wage war nowadays. So proportionality, we talked about this in the last one. Proportionality here is not necessarily proportionality on that strategic layer of like what is the war about and why are we waging it, but really with this it's on the tactical layer. So within inside of a battlefield, what are the means that we can use that are proportional to secure victory in this particular battle, right? And so this, if we can win the battle through some kind of means or tactics or strategy that that reduces loss of life, we should take that action. We shouldn't just carpet bomb the area, or we shouldn't maybe use things like chemical gas, right? That could be another way that we just say like certain means are just not justified. And so our proportionality in tactics must also meet our proportionality in strategy. And so we match our means necessary to accomplish the objective, whether that's on a strategic layer or on a tactical layer. This last one I put a question mark next to. I didn't necessarily see this with inside of the Christian tradition so much. It does get talked about a little bit, but this notion of kind of individual responsibility. How much individual responsibility do I have to mete out whether this is a just or unjust action? And certainly within the Christian tradition, there would be this notion of if you are asked to do something unjust, you don't do it. That's there. The question really becomes, am I supposed to be like evaluating those things constantly and trying to understand like what all is going on and like is this war just and like all of the questions that are going on? And Luther said to soldiers, it's okay to essentially trust your princes, to trust your officers and the authorities, trust that they are doing their jobs, that they are fulfilling their vocations well. And you don't necessarily have to go, try and understand every last dynamic of what's going on. If it's unclear to you, trust those in authority. Whereas, if you see something that's directly in front of you that's unjust, don't participate in that. Put a stop to that. That's just action there. So use post bellum. This is actually also not part of the historic kind of thinking. This is a fairly new addition to the conversation, actually the last 30 or 40 years or so. And this is the questions of how do we live out justice once the war has concluded. And so really there's three pieces here. Order. So we are just when we reestablish, order, right? The chaos of war has reigned. Now it is a time for order to be put back into place. Justice. So if there's people who need to be punished, if there's people who need to be recompensed, we pursue those things. We put in place justice. And then conciliation. We seek to bury the hatchet. We seek to take actions that increase our chances of being able to live together once again in peace and love, and true kind of unity and reconciliation, rather than take actions that could further hatred or the ability for us to move on. So that's kind of really those three big categories. I know I went through those really quickly. I'll plan to have a little handout and some other things that we can reference for the conversation, so we'll have these on there as well if there's questions about any of that. But by way of wrapping up, I kind of want to return us back to St. Paul's epistle to the Romans. So right before the passage that we read at the start of this video comes this: Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, Vengeance is mine. I will repay, says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For by doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So this is the instruction Paul is giving. Love your enemies, right? He's taking the words of Jesus. By doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. And then go straight into, but by the way, if they wrong you, if they are evil, call the cops, essentially, right? There are governments that have the sword, that execute the wrath of God. And then after that portion comes this verse: Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. So love bookends that section on the government authority ordained by God. And so what I want to leave you with is this thought that one of the ways in which we love our neighbor and even our enemy is by waging just war. We love our neighbor for sort of more obvious reasons. We're defending him, protecting him, rescuing him from harm. But we love our enemy in that when we are waging war against him, the means in which we take and the ways in which we do warfare against him, but also we love him by stopping him from doing evil. Okay? We stop him from sinning. We stop him from the injustice that he's wreaking. That is actually loving our enemy well. Okay? It's counterintuitive, but I think it's a thought-provoking and very valuable part of the Christian just war tradition. And so this conversation really kind of ultimately is framed around in Aquinas' thinking, the spiritual virtues. So there's faith, hope, and charity or love. So in this charity or love is a lot of where his thinking comes from about how we do just war. And so I'll kind of leave you there. I've probably gone on long enough already. Really looking forward to Thursday. I'll send out some other stuff for you guys to check out. If you have any questions or thoughts, we can, be talking about them in that Signal chat. Really looking forward to it. Again, invite anybody. This is a great thing to invite people to, and looking forward to chatting with all of you soon.